Very well then. Now we're going to get directly into the text, and we're going to be focusing on the introduction, because Father Francisco José López Saez writes an introduction, or elaborates an introduction, which will help us have a general idea of the whole purpose of this text, and we will be following, so to say, the main points. He says on page 13 that when the task of thought is born out of the existential search for truth, and when it turns into a vital task, it's then when the great creators in culture make an appearance. So, it is here where we indeed are able to detect two things. First, Pavel Florensky is one of these great creators in culture. And second, why? Because his task in thought is born out of the existential search for truth. It's not a mere curious erudition. So it's not about a mere idle investigation. But this existential search for truth is actually manifested as the great vital task that will be developing throughout the entire existence. And so the text says, when this total effort by the person is fertilized by some kind of suffering or even martyrdom, this thought effectively turns into testimony, and life touches the sphere of holiness. So, what we see in this sense is that this vital task, this existential search, precisely a search for truth, when this comes together with a kind of suffering and even of martyrdom, it's then when this existential search for truth, this vital task, surpasses its own initial lines of search, of research, and of effort, so that it can appear or manifest itself in a luminous way as testimony. Now this testimony, as Father López Saez mentions, or this vital task that touches holiness, was something quite frequent throughout the 20th century. And we have some examples here like Franz Rosenzweig, who wrote The Star of Redemption, a very important text that can help us understand contemporary Jewish thought. Ferdinand Ebner, a Protestant Christian, who's also engaged in the world of the dialogical, of the reasoning and uses of words dialogically, and with the nature of being Christian-inspired. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he was also imprisoned and confined, and whose texts also have some very luminous aspects. And of course, Edith Stein, who would become, as it happened not so long ago, Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, this great doctor of the Church. So what we see is that the 20th century, in spite of being characterized as having a special kind of historical murkiness, just think about the massive world catastrophes, such as the First World War, not to mention the Second World War, all the labor camps in what used to be the Soviet Union that would then be taken to Germany, and also the Nazi concentration camps, and the social revolutions, the revolts, genocides, crimes, and so forth. In spite of this situation, a truly complicated 20th century, these witnesses, these living testimonies, emerge and rise with luminous force for this vital task, which is the search for truth. A search for truth that is actually manifested as a fundamental task for every human being, especially in the most difficult times, just as the 20th century was, and as the 21st century is still being. Now, it's worth noticing that St. John Paul II, in his encyclical Fides et Ratio, mentions Florensky. And what he actually says about Florensky is that we can think of him as an example of this fruitful relationship between philosophy and the Word of God. And that is primarily searching for a new reunion in this true communion with the truth. You know, truth that's not only spoken, but also lived. And that's the reason why the author of the text tells us on page 14, second line, I invite you, dear reader, to pay attention to the spiritual itinerary of one of the most prominent representatives of the philosophical and religious Russian Renaissance of the early 20th century, Why? Because indeed, as the text tells us, this spiritual itinerary is about an authentic adventure that the Spirit engages in, especially as it is mentioned just 3 lines before the end of the book, precisely such as the ones that we're living today, that are characterized by great changes, of great mobilization, where it would seem as though it's getting harder and harder to find a firm point of support to help us direct our lives. In addition to a frantic search for the meaning of life, right? Where it seems as though there's a great crisis of meaning and we're trying to find alternatives that will enable us to achieve this longed-for self-realization as persons. And it's precisely in times like these, times of great change, in times of frantic search, and even continuous search, that we should find new paths for faith, and therefore for universal culture. So, this is to say, realize that throughout this course, what we too will be trying to encourage, or what we will be incorporating into this living impulse where the spirit of truth lies dormant and therefore lies everlasting life, we incorporate ourselves into this complete effort so we too can show these new paths for faith and for universal culture. So a project of culture that, as we saw during the previous presentation, depends primarily upon holiness. And to understand the itinerary, the fulfillment, and especially the demands of these new paths for faith. So, it's here that we can fully grasp one of the great contributions that this giant called Pavel Florensky is giving us, to put or to show us new paths for faith and for universal culture, and to make them accessible to us. And now, how should we properly understand Florensky? How should we properly understand his thought? Basically, we have 2 difficulties. The main one is that even though his work is pretty extensive, little of it has been translated, and even less into Spanish. There should be, or it's possible to find some of Florensky's work in Russian, and not even that would be easy to find. There are some texts in English, and I believe that there are some other texts in Italian. And I think that's the most that we can find of what's available in the work of Pavel Florensky. And in the case of Spanish, there are really just few texts. The main one, considered to be Florensky's major work, The Pillar and Ground of the Truth, was recently published in Spanish by Editorial Sígueme, translated precisely by Father Francisco José López Saez, the author of this text. So, well, thanks to this effort, we now have access to this work. There's another one, Reverse Perspective, a very short text on aesthetics that has also been published, Letters from Prison in the Camps, a selection of letters published in Spanish by EUNSA, and also The Salt of the Earth, in English and Spanish, which is something like a spiritual testament that Pavel Florensky writes about his Batyushka, of his spiritual father, Saint Father Isidore, and perhaps there's still one that I'm missing. But really, there's little out there. There's really little of Florensky's work. So in order to understand him, what we need to comprehend is the same structure that Florensky makes of his work. So, on page 15, from the 3rd line, the text reads, "Our author, Pavel Florensky, has divided his theological production, as well as philosophical and spiritual, all in one, remember, this unitotality, in 2 stages of different content and focus." So, here, it's worth highlighting the following. First, to realize that the content that Florensky is offering us, or the very contents, the subjects that Florensky will be developing, are not just clusters of information, but that they also represent guidance. And why? Because remember that to Florensky, this is about a living reality, and therefore we shouldn't be deceived into supposing that this is just about a mere theory that would have nothing to do or that wouldn't have an impact on the lives of men. Right? So, we should grasp in order to fully understand Pavel Florensky that the contents that he will be developing, and that fortunately, this text that we're studying is not limited only to the pillar and ground of truth, even though it's taken as the backbone, but that it also gives us several other texts that he himself translated and thus gave us access to. So these contents will also be manifested as means of guidance, right? So as stanzas to which we can direct all of our existence. Why? Because they are, as we have said, about a living reality. And in this sense, these guiding contents are distinguished by an effort of constructing an ultimate theodicy and anthropodicy. So, this living reality, to give it a name, would be divided in a theodicy and an anthropodicy. And here, what we will be trying to understand is in general what each of these stages consists of that will ultimately lead us into a unique path. So, to Florensky, both theodicy, and we will be talking about the main features of each of them, but both theodicy and anthropodicy constitute a unique path in such a way that they are not indeed divided. So it's not about separated endeavors. And what we can see is that the first stage, as we see in the text about 4 lines below, is distinguished, existentially distinguished, by the impact of monasticism and the study of spiritual life. So, to Florensky, the theodicy of this unique path is primarily distinguished by the living experience of monasticism on the one hand, the experience of monasticism that he will live as well, and on the other hand, the study of spiritual life. This is, we could say, like the theoretical part, the part that Florensky, within this unique path, addresses based on the experience of monasticism and the study of spiritual life. These two elements are precisely the fundamental starting points for theodicy. And on the contrary, anthropodicy is founded on the experience of marriage, because he was a married priest, as a good member of the Orthodox Church, and in priesthood. But a priesthood in the world. A priesthood that takes place in the world. So, what we have here, what we could call the fundamental roots that will be configuring this unique path, this living testimony that Florensky will develop through theodicy and anthropodicy. Theodicy, as we said, distinguished by the experience of monasticism and the study of spiritual life, and anthropodicy, distinguished by the experience of marriage and priesthood in the world. In addition to the development, a productive development that Florensky takes on in his scientific and cultural work. So, it's the subjects and methods of both, right? Of both faces that differ considerably. Why? Because, remember, really, to Florensky, the antinomy is a fundamental aspect of the configuration of our understanding and our Christian life. So, in theodicy, there's a method. And anthropodicy, in turn, has another method. And to understand this, we would have to elevate ourselves to a superior unity. And to reach, so to say, the elevation of our entire existence, and into this dimension that indeed demands that we have a true comprehension of this living reality. So, Florensky will try to even embody this antinomy and to develop it in the most coherent way. And that's why we see, and this is something that the author of the book mentions, that ultimately this unique path constitutes an itinerary. It involves a particular process in which this itinerary will also be having its own dynamic. On the one hand, this is an itinerary that involves a deep search, and that therefore, as Emmanuel Mounier would say, it will not settle for mere depths of surface. Right? For that which may seem to us as having depth, but that in reality, it's nothing more than a depth of surface. And on the other hand, also, by the experience, an itinerary of profound search and of experience. Thus, profound search as investigation and experience as in living. And therefore, the fundamental itinerary set by Pavel Florensky will make us acknowledge that we cannot divide what we think from what we live, and that both these things are also called to fertilize each other, that our life fertilize our thought, and that our thought also enrich our own experience of life, right? So that, in short, that we start growing as persons in an integral way, in this demand of unity. So, both investigation and experience constitute a demand of unity. And thus, it is this demand of unity which will take on the diversity of perspectives. And now we will explain this. This demand of unity takes on the diversity of perspectives. And here, we could perhaps make use of a little contrast to understand the difference between this diversity of perspectives and something like Nietzsche's perspectivism. Perspectivism, according to Nietzsche, means that every one of us is called to take on his own perspective, right? So in this sense, it turns out that everything becomes relative, and thus also then everything becomes subjective, right? So following this, perspectivism then ultimately points to a view in which things must vary according to one's perspective. This is not so in Florensky. To Florensky, to take on this diversity of perspectives means to actually grasp the comprehension demands that reality itself is asking us to consider. Thus, to realize that in order to understand the world, we need more than just one perspective, but that we need to consider many different perspectives, so that we can grasp different aspects and phases, nuances and contradictions, and even some discontinuities that are present in the very same complete ensemble. Perhaps the easiest way to express this would be by using an image, and this would be a musical image. When we have an orchestra that is masterfully performing a symphony, we can say that the melody is one, but each instrument constitutes a perspective through which, when all these perspectives come together, the total unity appears. So a violin's performance will give us a perspective in the configuration of this totality. Is that clear? And so does the piano or cello, or perhaps the viola or whatnot. They give us these perspectives that we have to try to actually grasp, even in their own discontinuity. Hence, not to take part in any reductionism whatsoever, but to understand that we're actually called to grow even within these perspectives as, or better, just as it's demanded by the comprehension of unity. So, to take on the diversity of perspectives will also involve an effort of comprehension. To realize that we will always be able to grasp something more than we can actually suppose. And this means that, as the author mentions on page 16, first line, we need to address the challenge that this existential multiplicity is giving us. Right? And this is where this primary challenge would come in, to take on the demand of this very existential multiplicity. And in this way, we could now say that we will not take part in the mistake of drawing limits on something that is still in need of being explored, and therefore investigated, and therefore lived. And so, to Florensky, one of the fundamental aspects is to never truncate or to never block either the profound search that the comprehension of reality demands, or to override or cancel out the many possibilities of experience that this search will in turn ultimately give us. Hence, never give up on Catholic spirit. This Catholic spirit of comprehension that will indeed lead us into a better grasp of humanity's own demands. And that is why we see on this same page, second line, that the disconcerting plurality of perspectives will actually turn into our author's greatest richness. So, what we should grasp is that Florensky is not really contradicting himself here, but that he's actually trying to remain faithful to reality itself. So, this living reality demands fidelity, not alteration, but what it demands, as we said, is fidelity, not distortion. So, in this existential multiplicity of perspectives that Florensky is developing, what we see is his profound commitment to fidelity, and therefore of no distortion about the very reality that he did not create. So, also in this sense, we could talk about a spiritual path where we are called to have an increasingly better knowledge of that which we did not create, which wasn't a product of ours. That which we have before us as a demand that will lead us further into stepping out of our own limits so that we can finally start to commune with this reality itself. Now, at the beginning of the next paragraph, the author wonders, what is the internal logic of the two stages of Florensky's thought? And by the way, is everything clear so far? Okay, so what is this internal logic then? What is the dynamic? First, in the Theodicy, Florensky addresses the study of the foundation of human reason. So, listen, in order to keep this fidelity, what Florensky looks for in the Theodicy is the foundation of human reason. And he will find that the authentic foundation of this human reason is not found in the subject, as opposed to what Kant, for example, proposed, but that this foundation, essential, primordial, substantial, unique, and authentic foundation of human reason is found in the living truth. Thus, in the unisubstantiality of the divine being. I know that this terminology may sound a little bit strange right now, but you'll get familiar with it. Remember that this is an introduction. Okay? So for now, we're just trying to give a clear overview. So, What Florensky will address in the Theodicy is the search for the foundations of reason. And this search for the foundations of reason will lead him to realize that reason is truly rooted. I think my writing today is worse than ever. Yeah, that actually, as we were saying, reason is rooted in the living truth. So, reason rests in something bigger than itself. Reason is not autonomous, but rather reason is heteronymous. It comes from a different origin than itself. And this origin is ultimately the dogma of the unisubstantiality of the divine being. So, the way in which Florensky traces the foundation of human reason and finds it in the living truth is precisely through the study of this dogma. Of the dogma, and we could also say of the impact that this brings into the experience of monasticism and also into the study of spiritual life. Now, Florensky's purpose is that precisely through the contemplation of dogma, one can get immersed in the ecclesiastic spiritual depth. Why? Because this ecclesiastic spiritual depth is where Florensky will find that the same laws about the over-rational synthesis of dogma reign together with the fundamental networks of the writings of the Holy Fathers. So, in short, what Florensky actually notices here is that the living truth manifested in dogma will take us to something that's super-rational. And this doesn't mean that it's separated from reason, but that it's actually its foundation, right? So here's where we can find one of the fundamental perspectives to understand the supra-rational not as something that's alien to reason itself, but as its foundation. So, not to go from here to there, not about seeing how far I can get. That's the Kantian vision. When Kant elaborates his critique, especially the critique of pure reason, what he understands as critique are the limits. How far can I go? How far am I capable of getting as a subject? And we could say that the clearest Kantian formulation is, what can I know, right? For example, right? What can I know? And what can I live, right? How can I act? What are my limits? Florensky, on the contrary, actually takes the opposite stance. It's not about how far I can get, but about where I come from. It's the profound tracing of the actual origins of what's human. And this initially takes us to overcome our own subjective limitations. This would be the first step to understand Pavel Florensky's perspective. It's not about how far I can get, about my own limits. What am I allowed to do? No, rather, where is it that I come from? Where do I originate from? I as a subject. And this is ultimately a fundamental supra-rational reality. It is to reconnect or to reunite with our authentic origin. This on the one hand. And this is precisely what Florensky calls Trinitarian personalism. And what is Trinitarian personalism? It is to recognize that the person has an origin and root in something other than himself, but that he comes from the living truth, thus from the unisubstantiality, thus the Trinity. So every time that we, for instance, throughout the classes, mention unisubstantiality, we should be able to clearly understand what it means. The Trinity, and the Trinity as the living truth. Now, is that clear? Theodicy? Okay, now, what about anthropodicy? What Florensky does with anthropodicy is to study the roots of all the aspects of human practical activity, thus culture. So, if here, in Theodicy, reason makes an appearance, in anthropodicy, what makes an appearance is human activity. In all, or should we say, in the possibility of all their practical fields. So, in addressing now, for instance, the aspects of human practical activity, so in general, human activity, or to put it briefly, culture, right? In general, human activity as culture, regarded as culture, then Florensky will take on, or we could say he will accept the challenge of recognizing that this practical human activity, or culture in general, can encompass everything from language to the elaboration of technical tools, and of course going also through the works of art. Right? So, what he has done, so to say, concerning reason, he will now apply to the aspect of culture, so in the practical aspect of human activity. And what will he find? That human activity itself is also not self-sufficient. We then have to really understand that one of the fundamental aspects to which he will manifest a firm opposition, and I think also with great forcefulness, is the invented notion of autonomy. While Kant was eager to show, by all means, that we are indeed autonomous beings, thus beings with a self-made law, and therefore that we are self-governing, that we can be distinguished by the capacity of self-governing that we have, what Florensky will ultimately insist on is that this is false. We are not autonomous. We are heteronymous. In this sense, we are linked to a distinct reality from ours. And hence, we cannot stay limited by the very inventions and caprices of subjectivity. But rather, we have to recover the integrity of reality itself, instead of cutting it off, right? Not to say, here's the limit, but to move on, so to say, to the other perspective, which is, in great length, what Florensky calls reverse perspective. And what is he going to find in this itinerary, in this stage of anthropodicy? That the profound roots of human activity are focused precisely on, or are rooted in, the activity of cult. So, if Florensky, here, in the field of theodicy, takes dogma as a fundamental guide, in anthropodicy, what Florensky will take as a fundamental guide is cult. In what particular aspect of cult? The sacraments. And in a very special way, the Eucharist. And why the sacraments? Because it's in the sacraments that Florensky will find this transfigured space-time. Why transfigured? Because that's where, in the sacraments, we find this fundamental antinomy of the earthly and of the heavenly, the visible and the invisible. Time, space, and the sacraments have been transfigured, and that's why the sacrament is mystery. If the heavenly were not really present, it wouldn't be a mystery. It would be just about anything. But in the sacrament, or the sacraments, and especially in the Eucharist, is where we can find this profound transfiguration of space and of time. And therefore, the world, humanized by cult, turns into the place where an authentic, redeemed organization reigns. Thus, Florensky finds that the authentic foundation of human practical activity, hence of culture, that is manifested through the sacraments, and the Eucharist in particular, is redemption. The redemptive action. In a nutshell, the redemption from the Savior, from Christ, and, obviously, from the Trinity. So, to Florensky, we can see that this search, or this unique path, contemplates the supra-rational, that as we said is the unisubstantiality, thus the living truth, thus the Trinity, and, on the other hand, it also addresses the complete work of this Trinity, which is precisely redemption, a redemption that's somehow already anticipated in the sacraments, and in a very special way in the Eucharist. So, in a manner of speaking, as we continue to move forward studying Florensky, we will at first focus on theodicy, and perhaps this is why we may find this field a bit more complicated, because what Florensky will be inquiring is the foundation of human reason. When we go through the first part of the itinerary of theodicy, and then move on to anthropodicy, then we will address the cultural phenomenon of man. And we will be tracing the way in which this cultural phenomenon has redemption as its fundamental root. So, to put it briefly, Florensky's study always contemplates the real and symbolic presence of both worlds, the visible world and the invisible world. That's why, to Florensky, to move across reality is not so complicated, because he takes it as a fact that these two worlds are ultimately manifested in reality. And this is what Florensky finds as the basis of the loss of sense, the logos, incarnated in matter, the flesh. So, to Florensky, the two worlds, precisely the spiritual and the material, is what allows us to understand the spiritualization of matter, or else the materialization of spirit. Thus, sense, the logos, that does the configuration, and the flesh. So then, reason, in theodicy now, appears as the logos. And in redemption, it appears as flesh. And here we see that these contents and guides will be talking about what we may call the invisible aspect of God in the Logos, and of the visible aspect of God in redemption, that is to say, in the flesh, and having precisely as our fundamental reference the incarnation, as I said, the fundamental antinomy through which everything else acquires true meaning, a true materialization, and its true fulfillment. So, what we see is that both stages, as we read in the text at the beginning of the next paragraph, constitute a same intellectual project. So, the itinerary is one. It's not about two opposite moments or two different situations. It's about stages of a unique path whose itinerary travels or goes through first the field of theodicy, and finally it will then move on to the field of anthropodicy. Or, to put it in different terms, what Florensky is looking for first is to free reason from its own constraints. And what for? What's the purpose of freeing it from its constraints? So that it's free to incarnate the living truth, thus holiness, to purify thoughts and actions. And this is precisely what Florensky labels an attempt of integral comprehension of the world. So, in this human activity, the one that was leading us to this demand of unity of these two stages, Florensky develops an attempt of integral comprehension of the world. And this attempt of having an integral comprehension of the world is what Florensky will eventually name a worldview. So the worldview is this attempt of an integral comprehension of the world in its two dimensions, both in the visible and, in both dimensions, the visible one and the invisible one, but in its fundamental unity. So to Florensky then, reality is not only what we see, but more than what we see. But this doesn't deny the visible. It simply encourages us to try to enrich, through an integral comprehension of the world, reality itself. And the comprehension demands that this actually entails. That's why, in this sense as well, Florensky attempts to present his work as a kind of answer. An answer to a contemporary world, the 20th century in particular, and also the 21st, that is thirsting for meaning. That is thirsting for more than what is happening. To fill the emptiness that, for example, exacerbated materialism has created in the human soul. To realize that, in short, material things do not fill the spirit of man. And on the other hand, these spiritualistic proposals of a world that is unreachable and incompatible with the carnal and material reality that we live in, and which will ultimately generate a profound longing in the human spirit, something from which we're ultimately uninstalled. On the one hand, what's purely material does not fill the soul, and on the other hand, what's purely spiritual seems to us to be unattainable and unmanageable, no matter how many attempts we perform. And the reason, to move forward a little bit, is quite simple. Why? Because we, as persons, are incarnated spirits. We are ultimately integral realities of visible aspects, but also of invisible aspects. And in this way, if we can't have this integral comprehension, that is precisely what Father Pavel Florensky wants to show us, we will not really find the peace that we're looking for, nor will we find our role in this world. We will ultimately find ourselves as alien to this reality that surrounds us, and of which we, whether we like it or not, are part of. That's why we see that, to Florensky, this living reality, this unique path, will ultimately have to become an experience, and a unique experience. To think and to live as an experience that is truly and profoundly enriching. That is why, to Florensky, and this is a noteworthy aspect that we shouldn't miss, contemplation is experience, thus life enrichment. As opposed to what we usually suppose, the contemplation is to step outside of the world so that we can have access to another reality, whatever that might be. Right? So, contemplation, experience in this sense, will take us to an experience of the living reality. And therefore, we could call, or better, Florensky will call this experience vision. In this vision, are you following me? Are we not going too fast? No? And this vision, Florensky accurately will find it located in the subject of beauty as the incarnation of idea in matter. So, to Florensky, vision, the one he wants to lead us to, is beauty. And why? Because to Florensky, beauty is not some kind of ornament of creation that could work as some kind of aesthetical stimulus. No, to Florensky, Beauty is the incarnation of idea in matter. In beauty, Florensky will say, there is where the incarnation of idea in matter is lived. Thus, beauty is ultimately the concrete incarnation of the invisible. So, to Florensky, beauty is incarnation of idea in matter. And therefore, beauty will indeed constitute for us the most fervent symbol of this integrity of the world, both of the visible and the invisible. And Florensky will also say that if in Theodicy beauty appears as the incarnation of idea in matter, hence ultimately the incarnation, the materialization of the invisible, of the spiritual in matter, in Anthropodicy, beauty shows up as our pneumatological coronation, thus as holiness. So, what would it be in this sense from the perspective of Anthropodicy? What would beauty be then? The spiritual coronation of Christian holiness. So, we see that beauty has a manifestation in Theodicy, the incarnation of idea in matter, the materialization of the invisible in the visible, or in other words, the fundamental antinomy of the invisible made visible in the material world. And beauty, in Anthropodicy, is our pneumatological coronation, thus our spiritual coronation. That is to say, the holiness of Christian life. So, from the theoretical point of view, from the theoretical perspective that Florensky develops, we could say that beauty appears in Theodicy as the authentic contemplation, the contemplation of the two worlds in the same reality. Thus, the contemplation in spirit and in truth of God's creation. There lies beauty, a beauty that wouldn't be disfigured, that wouldn't be incomplete due to the failure of integrating these two elements, right, of the two worlds. Whereas in Anthropodicy, beauty appears as the culmination, the coronation of Christian life, thus holiness. So, if here it's contemplation, ultimately the highest reason, a reason of great level, an elevated reason that takes us to the integral contemplation of reality, in Anthropodicy, beauty will then be manifested as the spiritual coronation, the transfiguration of human reality itself. And that transfiguration of human reality itself is exactly what would be called in this sense holiness. In other words, what is this pneumatological and spiritual coronation of Christian life, hence holiness? It is the incarnation of the image of God in the whole empirical and mundane scope of the person. That is holiness. So holiness now in Anthropodicy is featured as the incarnation of the image of God in the whole empirical and mundane scope of the person. A scope, as the text reads on page 17, more or less in the middle of the second paragraph, 7 or 8 lines through, which says, a scope that includes everything from his face and on to the technical results of his activities, going through his social and cultural work, and who is called to be transfigured in the divine likeness. So, what we can see going on here, in the case of Anthropodicy regarding beauty, is the total transfiguration of human life. From his face, right, from his face, that's already seen as a different reality, going through each and every one of his social and cultural activities, or the technical development of his capacities, until finally reaching the incarnate projection, the incarnate reality of the divine likeness. Therefore, ultimately, both Theodicy and Anthropodicy talk about one and the same thing, the beauty of the Spirit, as an eternal memory of life, as a Trinitarian life, with a sacramental participation in the liturgical memory of cult. So, basically, what both Theodicy and Anthropodicy talk about or lead us to as two stages of the same itinerary is precisely to the experience of Christian beauty. So, ultimately, to the beauty of the incarnate Spirit, incarnate in creation and incarnate in man. So, what we see is that, indeed, Florensky is leading us to the experience of beauty. Beauty as an experience. So, we now understand beauty not as some kind of subjective assessment, nor as some kind of distortion of human taste. No, we understand beauty as an experience. An experience that, in Theodicy, is called contemplation. And so, to contemplate the integrity of the world, right? The unity of the world, visible and invisible. And in Anthropodicy, it's called holiness. The theoretical and the practical gathered together in the same person. Why? Because to Florensky, it's clear that this contemplation is indeed a contemplation of the integral creation, just as it is of the real creation. And on the other hand, this experience of beauty and holiness appears now as the integral man. Thus, the rescued man, the man that has been transfigured, and that this transfiguration does have something to do with the radical modification of our perception of the world, and therefore of our own behavior in the world. And it's likely here that Florensky had someone in mind, one of his countrymen, called Saint Seraphim of Sarov. His biography, the biography of Saint Seraphim of Sarov, was made known by his disciple, Motovilov. Motovilov was good friends with Saint Seraphim of Sarov. This is so you can see what I mean. And, Saint Seraphim, who was a man of the 19th century, is considered as the Russian Saint Francis. This because he had a great communion and harmony with creation. He lived in the forest and was friends with a bear, right? So Saint Seraphim of Sarov was frequently consulted because, as you may remember, fathers are in charge of helping souls in their paths in life, and so people would visit him and he would always have something to give them. So sometimes Saint Seraphim of Sarov would have a visitor, and if he didn't have anything, he would go out and talk to the bear, and then come back with the bear carrying a honeycomb, or a trout, or berries, or anything to give him. But once, when he was talking to his disciple, Motovilov, and he asks Saint Seraphim to tell him when will the time be when he will have access to what his master is living. And he reports that at that moment, he opened his eyes that were closed, and as he contemplated Saint Seraphim of Sarov, he saw that his whole face was transfigured and very luminous. And not only his face, but everything around was being perceived differently by Motovilov. And what Motovilov wants to say is that he had then already experienced what? Beauty, both in man and in creation. And so he then asks Saint Seraphim of Sarov, "Batyushka, father, right? What's going on?" And Seraphim asks, "Why?" "Because your face is luminous and something has changed around us." And Saint Seraphim then replies, "Do you see it? Yes, so then you too have been transfigured." In short, This is more or less what Florensky has in mind. The experience, or beauty as an experience, is an experience of transfiguration. It transfigures our thinking, our seeing, our feeling, our living, our working. It transforms absolutely everything. And this is precisely, right, the itinerary that Florensky will be trying in this sense to trace, rescue, and uncover, and especially, basically giving us the fundamental guidelines so that each and every one of us can live it. And that's why it will be very important to Florensky that we get used to the totality, that we overcome first this Western tendency of division, of fragmentation, and therefore that we aspire at least to reach out to this higher reality where this integral beauty lies, that we also participate in this joy, in the rejoice that such an experience entails. If we go to page 18, we see that from the second paragraph, the text says, Florensky is not really trying to build the system, but rather the organic expression of a living totality. So, this experience, as well, the experience of transfiguration, means the organic expression of a living totality. Organic expression of a living totality. And this organic expression of a living totality cannot be reduced to a system. Why? Because, in simple terms, the system possesses in itself its own regulation. You need to have codes so that the system will work, and finally, to exclude everything that's foreign to the system. That's why, to Florensky, it is very important that we realize that life is not a system. Let's give a very basic example. Simple, but I believe very forceful, to understand what is meant by life not being a system. A mathematical system is precise, and it's so precise that it's required, for instance, in the configuration of computational systems. To elaborate artificial languages, and to put it briefly, the system has to work perfectly so that this technological system can get running. And we have an expert here, right? So, and please correct me if I'm wrong. Say I'm just talking about what I can understand. And yeah, and certainly I'm a layman here. And so, the elaboration of the system is what's most fundamental, in such a way that what you're looking for in the system is a continued prediction. So that if I know that I enter A plus a different algorithm to join it with B, the result must be C, right? I'm not a mathematician either, so you can feel free to throw something at me, right? Alright, but it's the precision of the operation which causes the system to rule out any kind of unforeseeable possibility, of the unexpected. In the system, I know that if I move this thing will be generated. A calculation. To Florensky, it's clear, and bear in mind that Florensky was a mathematical genius. We haven't mentioned his biographical profile. No, not yet. We're following we're taking it step by step. But he was an extraordinary genius. In fact, Pavel Florensky, in his mathematical studies, is the true father of cybernetics. The one who laid the foundations for the elaboration of these computer languages. But, what's important here is that within the system, there's no room for surprises. Everything must be under control. Otherwise, it doesn't work. In general. But Florensky realizes that life is not a system. And why? Because in life, it's impossible to keep the vital dynamic of everything that exists under some kind of strict precision. For example, I know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. And that this hasn't changed, right? That I have no problems there in the 2 plus 2. I know that within the system, there's already a determined functionality. Everything's been calculated. I know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. But in life, in life's own manifestation, 2 plus 2 is not always 4. For example, instead of 2, let's think. This boy is very honest and very sincere. And let's add now that he's very well educated, faithful, and he loves me. The result would be, I will marry him. But the result can be, I'm not interested. I'll choose the thug. There, 2 plus 2 is not 4. In the system, for example, in the Nazi concentration camps, I'm thinking now of an example by Nikolai Steinhardt from his extraordinary book, The Happiness Diary, that says, you're part of the army. Add to this that you obey orders, and the result will be that you execute them, right? You're a soldier. You have to do your duty. So this means that you will execute your orders. But Nikolai Steinhardt would say, in life, 2 plus 2 is not 4. You're a soldier, I give you an order, and the soldier disobeys. And so the soldier could be told, kill this woman, right? You're a soldier. That's the first 2. Add to this that as a soldier, as a member of my system, you're under my command. And so the order is, kill this woman. So what do you get? Well, to kill her, right? In the system, 2 plus 2 must be 4. But in life, he says, even among the Germans they would say, you're a soldier, it's known that you're under the system, the order is given to kill that woman, and the soldier disobeys. He says, I won't do it. Oh, so then I will kill you. Kill me then. And that's why, in the 20th century, with these totalitarian experiences, or these totalitarian regimes, this whole notion of a system was called into question. Why? Because when life has been intended to work as a system, especially regarding mathematical precision, and also this idea of ruling out any possibility outside the system, they realized that this was generating extraordinary violence. And why? Because life in this sense is not a system. And this is the reason why Florensky will make a distinction, as we said, between life and a system. And also we can mention that even Florensky's style is circular. Circular, not repetitive. Watch out, okay? The Greek idea of an eternal return, that would later on also intoxicate Nietzsche, is the repetition of the same. That's the eternal return. It's like a repetition of the same. For example, the 4 seasons. And due to climate change, it's hard to perceive this eternal return. But it's like the way harvest is done. Like, for example, if I sow something, a plant is generated, it's cyclical. In Florensky, it's circular, but not repetitive. Why? Because for each return, each turn that is made to go back to the original point, an unsuspected reality is grasped. I don't know if this is clear. It is possible to now grasp a new or different dimension that had previously remained unnoticed. It's like what some good readers do sometimes. They read the same book several times, and they always find something different. Something had been missed. So, the circularity is important so that we can realize that we're facing something that's practically inexhaustible and not repetitive. So this means that it's necessary many times, right, to turn back to the same issue so that we can now grasp previously unnoticed nuances, also enriching aspects that we hadn't noticed, and finally as well, to continue being enriched and feeding on this inexhaustible source. Non-repetitive. Never repetitive. Everything we see is good. Sorry, it's new. Someone who also grasped this was Edith Stein. If you read the extraordinary work, Finite and Eternal Being, you will see that when she talks about this inexhaustible source, she says, we simply suppose, for example, that a plant, right, it's an example, that a plant grows by itself due to its organic force, right? So if I plant a seed, I will get a little plant or maybe then a tree or whatever. But Edith Stein says it's not like that. Why? Because reality can only be sustained by the donation that God makes to its being. To put it simply, it's not as if God creates and then things go on their own. But instead, it's more like God being in front of everything and giving conservation at every instant to everything that exists. Everything. That's a quite different perspective. So, in this light, we would see that if we were able to reach true contemplation, we would see that the leaf, interestingly, or that the plant that we see is not the same. Nonetheless, it is the same. And this is what I want you to start getting into, conflicts in reason, which is what helps us to create these necessary ruptures, this ascetic, as we'll see. And why? Because ultimately, to Florensky, this inexhaustible source that's never repetitive is none other than the truth. Truth is an inexhaustible source that's never repetitive and whose mystery will take us to the realization of the depth of God Himself. And how is it that this depth of God Himself is also captured in the created work? Succinctly, it seems that Florensky is asking us to consider the following. What has been created is not as simple as we suppose. What has been created has the mark of its creator. And so, this takes us to overcome these entirely simplistic perspectives. This is very important to grasp, because what Florensky is reminding us is that reality, right, truth, is Trinity. And therefore, what's been created is not as simple as what we see in reductionist perspectives, whether from science, from art, from philosophy, anthropology, economy, politics, and so forth. It's not the right way, but rather, reality itself is, for us, an inexhaustible mystery, because it emanates, so to say. It manifests its profound link with the one who created it. That's why, to Florensky, the organic expression of a living totality is perfectly coordinated with truth itself, which is the Trinity. Maybe if we try to put it in simpler terms, sometimes it's not easy with Florensky, we could say that to Florensky, the whole creation has the image of its creator. And this image of the creator is not a simple image. It's an image that we cannot exhaust. Why? Because this image, living image of reality, is ultimately the presence as a creator of God Himself. And therefore, it's ultimately a mystery. This is quite opposite to the scientific trend of the 20th century. A simple example: to reduce the living elements of reality to mere chemical formulations. Water is H2O. That's it. There it ends. There's no mystery, there's nothing more, right? Or also human beings to a mere bios, or to a mere biological organism with some programmed functionality. You're born, you grow up, you develop and reproduce, and then you die. And the same for a flea, for a corn cob, an elephant, or a teacher of philosophy, right? Everything's the same. Thus, simplification, naivete, and therefore the disfigurement of truth. So, to Florensky, it's quite clear that truth requires integrity. Thus, preservation of the mystery. And what is actually the mystery? God Himself. That's the integrity. When we disintegrate the truth, when we separate the creator from the creature, we nullify the mystery, and what's worse, we disfigure reality itself. We're ultimately, accepting a lie, a deception, and a falsity. And this is also a very important aspect which Florensky will make us aware of. Okay. That's why, if we go to page 19, for example, more or less about 6 or 7 lines before the end of the paragraph, the text talks about a harmony of the peak. And this is a beautiful expression. Why? Because indeed, this integrity, this preservation of the mystery, will finally take us to a harmony of the peak. Thus, to a rapport, a fundamental commitment with this superior reality that encompasses and configures everything and also sustains it. So, it's very important to rise to this harmony of the peak in spite of our own limitations, to let ourselves, in this sense, be enriched by the objectivity that certainly surpasses us. And in this harmony of the peak, what we will also find, and this is a fundamental thing, is, on the one hand, of course, the luminous manifestation of what's created, but also, we will find, for instance, the most painful contradictions of the human heart. Because we have to remember that even in this harmony of the peak, not only in our created world, concrete, real, where we are living is not only light, but also shadows. And we actually need to overcome this to finally reach a symphonic comprehension, to overcome the supposed contradictions that in many ways frighten human reason. And they cause it to either go back or else to take a simple, simplistic stance. For example, from the false optimists that say that everything's okay, to the false pessimists that say that everything's wrong. So, Florensky says no, we have to learn to actually integrate all these living contradictions that we have in our reality, both internal and external, until we can reach a true harmony of the peak. Thus, until finally we participate in the fundamental experience called beauty. In fact, this experience, which is beauty in contemplation and holiness, is the true spiritual experience, That is the true spiritual experience, the most profound. So, we have to ultimately understand the great Pavel Florensky as a great orchestra conductor. As a great orchestra conductor that indeed is actively trying to lead us in the same way as an orchestra conductor does it, into the harmony of the peak. To go, just as it happens in a symphony, to go from these strident, incoherent, and chaotic preparations to the embodiment of the final result. When we go to a concert, for example, with symphonic music, and the conductor hasn't come out, the orchestra is tuning, but it sounds horrible. Each one of them, isn't it? Sounds like that, but when the conductor comes out and it begins, the result is extraordinary. So, this is, in simple terms, let's say, the fundamental purpose that Florensky is proposing and that we accept and share. To go from darkness to light. That's the itinerary. The itinerary of the peak's harmony. To have access to the peak's harmony, it's required to go, so to transit, from darkness to light. And this will be a gradual process. in which we're called to grow uninterruptedly, to finally reach this amplitude that surpasses us, but also at the same time configures us. And for this reason, we see that ultimately, what Florensky is presenting us with is the fundamental step from darkness into light, both theoretically or rationally, and practically or empirically. So Florensky, in this sense, is offering us freedom from mistake through communion with the truth, and therefore to regain our communion with God. And that is precisely, right, the fundamental purpose of Christ from his incarnation. For that reason, if we go to page 21, Father José López Saez says, from the second line, I hope that the reader will find in Florensky's texts the wonders of a whole theological landscape, full of harmony in the vital contrast, forged in equilibrium of the highest potential, the equilibrium of self-improvement, to and from the same unitriune truth that receives in its relatedness the roots and fruit of all human activity, thus sacramentally turning into eternal memory of life. So, this point about going from shadow to light is exactly an effort of self-improvement. To go to the greatest, and I am not it, but it's He who is the truth, He who is the way, He who is the life, and He who is not alone, He who is ultimately unitriune, unisubstantiality, thus Trinity, thus Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. If we look at this, trying to summarize and to make this point, we'll see that every time we do the sign of the cross as Christians, and we do it in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Florensky, in a manner of speaking, will tell us what we should do. What does this sign entail? And ultimately, or where it leads us ultimately into, is to manifest ourselves as what we really are, living symbols of the incarnate truth, and therefore living testimonies of the Holy Trinity who lives and reigns forever and ever. Well, thank you very much. We'll see you next time. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.